Hello everybody, my name is Suman Dua. I'm a registered migration agent based in Brisbane, Australia. In this video today, we will be talking about the business visa 188 in the significant investor visa stream. So as you all know that in the recent federal budget announcement, business visas will be given priority this year, and also they have almost doubled the numbers from almost 6,000 places to 13,500 places this year. So 188 is a provisional business visa and it has 5 streams. So the stream that we are going to talk about in detail today is the significant investor visa stream, which is part of the business innovation and investment visa program. And this is a provisional visa and it is also known as 188C. So this is an initiative by federal government to attract high net worth individuals who wish to gain permanent residency in Australia. Now this visa is granted for 4 years and 3 months and it has a pathway to permanent residency visa, which is subclass 888. So this visa is for applicants who can invest $5 million in complying significant investment in Australia for a minimum of 4 years. The benefits of this visa are that there are no age limits. So you could be over 55 and still can apply for this visa. Whereas with the other stream like 188A, which is the business innovation stream, and 188B, which is the investment visa, the age limit is up to 55, but there are waivers available in those two other streams in exceptional circumstances. But for 188C, significant investor visa, the visa that we are talking about in this video today, has no age limits, and also there is no requirement of meeting the points test. So with the other streams, you do have to have a minimum of 65 points with 188A and 188B, but with this stream there is no requirement of meeting the points test. Also, you can get a waiver for the English test as well, as long as you pay the fee for the waiver of the English test. So the requirement to live in Australia is also greatly reduced. So you only need to live in Australia for 40 days in a year in your 4 years to then apply for your permanent visa. Now for this visa, you must be nominated by the state or territory or Austrade, and you must have intention to live in that state. You or your spouse, or together with your spouse, you should have net assets of a minimum of 5 million Australian dollars. It's also very important that you or your spouse have never been involved in any unacceptable business activities. You must invest a minimum of 5 million Australian dollars into complying investment in Australia, and you must be willing to hold this investment for a minimum of 4 years. We will be talking in detail about how this $5 million needs to be invested, and for this we have actually invited a special guest in this program today. So we will be doing a Zoom session with the guest from Moelis Australia, who will be explaining you how this $5 million needs to be invested and what the requirements are. But before that, I just want to show you this slide on my screen, which will actually explain you the whole process involved with this visa. So as you can see that first you will have to lodge an expression of interest in the skill select system, which means that you're expressing to the state or Austrade that you are interested to apply for this visa. And then usually it can take up to a week for the state to come back to you and they invite you to lodge the visa. And then once you lodge the visa application, it may take 12 to 15 months for the department to assess your application. So once the case officer is happy with your documents, they will invite you to make that complying investment of $5 million. They usually give you anything from 28 days to 70 days to make that investment. So once you have made that investment, you will be given 4 years and 3 months on your visa, and after 4 years you are eligible to lodge the 888 visa as long as you have met all the conditions for 888 visa. Now it's very important that the investments are done through an Australian financial service licensed fund manager. So for this reason we have invited enda.stankard from Moelis Australia. So let me give you a bit of introduction about Moelis Australia. So Moelis Australia is one of the Australia's largest significant investor visa fund managers and were the pioneer of the program, working closely with Australian federal and state governments since its inception in 2012. Moelis Australia is an ASX-listed financial services group specializing in asset management, corporate advisory and equities. Now, since launching in 2009, they have advised on transactions worth over 110 billion, assisted clients to raise more than 10 billion in equity capital markets, and currently have approximately 5 billion in assets under management. Now, their specialist SIV team, they are in Sydney, Hong Kong, Melbourne and Shanghai, offering a range of solutions to high net worth investors. Now, Moelis Australia is commonly accepted as the SIV leader in Australia, and they regularly participate in events with the state governments and industry groups such as Migration Institute of Australia, Australia China and Business Council, Financial Services Council and Australia Chambers of Commerce in Asia. enda.stankard is the Managing Director in MA Asset Management arm of Moelis Australia in Sydney, and enda has been involved in the SIV program since its inception, when Moelis Australia helped introduce the concept to Australian government. As the pioneers of the program in Australia, Moelis Australia Asset Management have now grown to be Australia's leading SIV fund manager, having helped hundreds of SIV investors to make their complying investments. Now, enda is also a part of the SIV subcommittee of the Financial Services Council, which is responsible for providing feedback to the Australian government on behalf of the members of Financial Services Council. So we will soon be joined in our Zoom session by enda.stankard, who will be providing us some more information about how these $5 million need to be invested. So I would like to welcome enda.stankard in our Zoom session today. So this is an information session for the 188 significant investor visa stream. And like initially, I've touched base about the complying investments. So I think I would like enda to maybe take over from here and maybe explain our viewers what exactly these complying investments are and how does this, investment works.
Okay, thanks, Suman. Yes, the SIV complying investment framework are the rules that the Australian government has put in place for all investors for the significant investor visa program on how they need to invest their $5 million. So these rules have been in place since 1 July 2015. They were originally put in place by Austrade, which is a government department. But now the monitoring is done by a government department called the Department of Home Affairs. And they're responsible for all visa applications and for monitoring those visa applications to ensure that they meet the requirements. The complying investment framework itself is split in three parts. It's split between two mandatory parts, so 10% into venture capital private equity, which is mandatory, and 30% into emerging companies or listed small cap companies, and that's also mandatory. And then the remaining part is a balancing investment of 60%, and that can be invested according to your choice of funds, including in commercial property, in bonds, or in listed equities.
So, and because we get so many questions from our clients who are actually interested in this stream, but I also believe there is not much information out there regarding about these funds, because $5 million is a lot of money, and people are not aware at what stage this money needs to be invested. So I've kind of explained earlier in my video that at what stage the case officer will actually ask them to put that money in. But of course, before they start looking at this visa, they need to know exactly where their money will be going and who will be managing it. One of the questions that I do keep getting is that who is eligible to manage complying SIV funds? What organization monitors fund managers?
Sure, that's a very good question. So the compliance of the SIV program or the monitoring of the program is actually done by the Department of Home Affairs, the DHA. So the Department of Home Affairs are the government department that are responsible for the SIV program, and they're the ones who monitor to make sure that the funds have been invested according to the framework. So what they will do is they will check to ensure that the investor has invested in the required funds at the beginning, and then they'll also check at the end of the four-year program before they grant permanent residency to the investor. Now, in Australia, the funds management industry is actually a very large, well-established and mature industry. Australia is a very well-established financial services sector. And as a result of that, it's actually very well regulated. So fund managers such as ourselves are regulated and monitored by ASIC, which is the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. So ASIC, they grant a license to fund managers like ourselves called an AFSL, an Australian Financial Services License. And without that AFSL, we cannot offer funds to SIV investors. So ASIC are responsible for monitoring us and making sure that fund managers do the right thing. And if we don't, that license can be taken away. That AFSL can be taken away and mean we can't continue our business. So
exactly.
it is a very well-regulated industry. And in the case of significant investor visa funds, you have the Department of Home Affairs monitoring, but you also have ASIC monitoring fund managers to make sure we're doing the right thing.
Exactly. So it's very important that when a client chooses their fund manager, they do, of course, they do all these checks before they choose somebody to do it. And I would also like to mention here that, you know, you are one of the leaders in this, you know, as a fund manager, you're seen as one of the leaders in Australia. So if somebody is coming to Moelis Australia to help with their investment, I think, you know, you guys will be the best to be contacted for this stream.
Thanks, Suman. Yeah, you're right. It's a very wise thing for investors, significant investor visas, to start doing due diligence or start doing their research on the fund that they would like to choose for their complying investments for the SIV. Now, as you've probably mentioned, the investment itself doesn't have to be made until the end of the process. So you would normally take the applicant through the process, the visa process, submit their application to the Department of Home Affairs, and then answer the questions that the department officials will have. And then at the end of that process, the department will issue an invitation letter and say, right, we're now ready for you to make your complying investment within a fund manager in Australia. And that's when you need to make the investment, at the end of the process.
Yeah.
But normally what an investor will do is they will start to make inquiries earlier than that. They'll start to do their due diligence and do their research earlier than that. And it's a very good idea to engage with the fund manager like us early in the program, so you can start to understand what are the options available to you. You can start to monitor the fund and the performance, and also to keep in touch with us to make sure that we can update you on the economy, on the market, how things are going. And then when it comes to making a decision on your final investment, you're going to be well informed and well educated, and you'll have an idea of where you want to allocate the funds. So that's a typical the typical process an SIV investor would follow. And we here at Moelis are available at any time investors have questions. They can contact us and reach out, and we're happy to have a call, either face-to-face if we can, or a Zoom call like this with investors to take them through the details, and then email further information to them to consider.
Sure. And you touched based on VCPE. So that's also another question that we do keep getting, that what exactly it is and how do these VCPE funds work? And, you know, because they're known for high risk component of it as well. So can you please explain maybe with one example of an investee company that your VC fund has, you know, invested in, and how do you normally exit these investments? Because these are not as liquid as listed shares, for example.
You're right. Yeah, that's to be honest, that's probably the most common question we get asked about the by SIV investors. It's always around the venture capital private equity component. Now, even though it's only 10% of the overall investment amount, SIV investors are typically very focused on this component because you're right. It typically would be a more high risk investment and it's more illiquid. So it's not like listed shares where you can buy and sell them on the market on any one day. An investment in private equity or venture capital is typically a longer term investment, which, you know, could be anything from 3, 4, or 5 years long. In our case, we look at investments from a 3 to 5 year horizon. So it's very important for investors to understand and do due diligence on the fund manager that they choose for that. But I'd just like to say that, you know, the VCPE component does not have to mean high risk. The rules do not require you to invest in startups or early stage or seed capital at all. In fact, all they say is that they have to invest in unlisted companies. So companies that are not yet listed on the stock market and that are under $250 million in size. So actually the companies can be very mature. They can be old companies. They can be profitable companies. They can have very well-established businesses in Australia. and they're all eligible, just as long as they're not listed and they're not involved in the areas of property. So, for example, ownership of land or rent, that's also not permitted. So the VCPE does not have to be as high risk as investors sometimes perceive. It can actually be well-established companies that are actually quite low risk and quite well-established.
Okay, that is actually good to know. Okay, so another question I've got here is, how does the emerging companies fund work? Why is compliance particularly important for this part? And how does Moelis Australia decide on investment strategies, and what is the average return like? And also they want to know, how did this fund perform during COVID?
Sure, that's a very good question. And yes, I'd just like to say that the emerging companies is probably as, if not more important to consider than the venture capital component. So the emerging companies component has a minimum investment requirement of 30% of the 5 million or 1.5 million. And this has to be invested in a fund which invests in listed companies. So these are companies that are listed on the stock market here in Australia, and they have a market capitalization or a size of under 500 million. So there are a number of rules that the government has put in place for this component, which must be met at all times. For example, on the number of investments you have, the size of those companies, the maximum investment in any one company, the amount of cash in the fund. All of those things are monitored by the government, and you must make sure that you monitor, keep an eye on them at all times. So again, when you're choosing your fund manager, it's very important to choose a fund manager who's got a good track record and who understands the SIV rules very well, because at the end of the day, the most important thing for our investors is to make sure that the fund manager keeps their visas safe and make sure that we're investing in investments which meet the complying investment framework. So the number one rule, and the first question you should ask any fund manager you speak to is, how many SIV investors have you done? How familiar are you with the rules, and what systems and procedures have you got in place to make sure that the fund always meets the SIV complying rules?
Excellent. So I think they also want to know what are the different types of investment choices for the balancing investment component. So from safe to risky, and what is the average return like for each type? So if you can just give a bit of an idea.
Sure. So actually the balancing investment is the part where investors can have an element of choice. So they can put the entire 60% or $3 million into one type of fund, or they can mix it across different funds. But generally the choices that are open to them are funds investing in commercial property. So commercial property, by that I mean generally funds investing in retail malls, industrial assets, healthcare assets, office buildings, and so on. Residential property is not an option for the SIV, so you cannot invest in residential property for this component. The other option is listed equities, and they can be large or small. So unlike the emerging companies component, for the balancing investment, you can invest in any listed companies. They could be large companies listed on the stock market or small. The government doesn't restrict you. And finally, the safest option or the lowest risk option is always corporate bonds. So these are bonds which are issued by Australian Stock Exchange listed companies or ASX listed companies. And in the case of the majority of these bonds are generally issued by the big banks here. So in Australia, we have some very large banks, the big four being ANZ, CBA, Westpac, and NAB. Those four banks themselves would issue the majority of bonds. And of course, those banks are very safe, very low risk. So those bonds are considered a very conservative and low risk investment option. So it's possible for you to structure an investment for your complying investment, which is very conservative and very stable and very low risk, particularly if you choose bonds for the balancing investment component.
Yeah, that's good that they can actually choose their investment strategy, and maybe I hope like they can sit with you guys and then plan, how much risk they want to take and then just go from there.
Absolutely. So what we do all the time is we will sit with our investors, get to understand what their preferences are, what they're trying to achieve. We have some investors who are looking to achieve a very stable return. They just want a very low risk investment and want to be able to ensure that they get their capital back at the end. And so in that case, those investors will typically choose a balancing investment, which is something like bonds. We have some investors who will look for an investment option which delivers them predictable or stable cash flows. For example, they may be using this investment to fund their lifestyle in Australia or pay rent for their children maybe at school here. So they're using this investment to fund their living expenses in Australia. And those investors will typically want a very predictable cash flow. So they will often choose a property fund or a bond fund for the balancing investment, or even a combination of the two. And then we have other investors who are looking for a higher return. So those investors are happy to take a little bit more risk to adopt a more aggressive investment strategy. And they will often choose listed equities for their balancing component, which means that they're happy to take a little bit more risk on their investment in order to achieve that higher return over the medium to long term.
Yeah, of course. And then, it depends on the individual as well, how they want to do it, and you're happy to work with them the way they want to plan their
That's right.
investment
And it's very
strategy.
important to note, Suman, that investors can actually switch during the period of their visa. So they're not restricted for the whole 4 years to invest in the same thing. Now, as long as the fund allows it, you are allowed to switch between funds within each of the categories we talked about. So the venture capital, private equity, the emerging companies, or the balancing investment. So generally that will most often be the balancing investment. You can switch between bonds, equities, and property. And investors will sometimes change their minds depending on their risk tolerance. For example, this year, with all the volatility we saw here in the markets, we had a lot of investors who were choosing to remain invested in bonds, which were very stable. And then as the market emerges from COVID and the volatility reduces, investors feel more comfortable to exit bonds and switch across to equity or property opportunities as they arise. So that's one of the good things about SIV. It does offer you flexibility. It does allow you to switch your investments during the period of the visa, provided that you meet certain requirements from the government. And investors' risk tolerance can change over the term of the 4 years as well. So the visa does allow you to change from one investment to another during the period.
Okay, that's really good information there. So the next one I have got here, and I think you have touched base on this one before, how to avoid substantial risks in choosing SIV products and fund managers. What should investor consider when choosing a manager?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And it's very important, investors are investing a lot of money for this visa. $5 million is a lot of money for anybody. And quite often investors are sometimes investing for the first time in Australia, or even for the first time with an external fund manager. So we spend a lot of our time explaining funds, how they work, the investment environment here in Australia, and also how fund managers operate and are regulated by the Australian government. So the first and most important choice you have to make is who you choose to manage your complying investments, which fund manager you choose for your investment. And I think the most important things to look out for here are track record, of course. What is the track record of the fund manager? Do they have experience in managing these type of funds? How long have they been doing it? What sort of returns have they achieved for their funds over the short term, the medium term, and importantly, the long term for the funds? Secondly is transparency. So you need to know who is the fund manager, what is their ownership structure, how strong is the company, what is the financial position of the company. And in this case, it's helpful if the company is a listed company. So if you're investing with a fund manager which is listed on the ASX, then that you can go to the ASX website, you can view their audited accounts, you can view their shareholders, everything there is to know about them, and the financial position, and that they're going to be around in 4 years' time when your visa matures. You want that fund manager still to be there. And then thirdly, and also just as important, is what is this fund manager's experience in the SIV program? So has this fund manager been involved in the program from inception? Do they understand the rules of the SIV very well? Are they going to manage your funds in accordance with the SIV complying investment framework and keep your visa safe? That's a very important thing to consider. Are they committed to the SIV program? Are they still going to be there in 4 years' time in order to sign the documents for the government at the time you require your permanent residency? So there are three very important things to consider: track record, transparency, and also experience and commitment to the SIV program.
Yeah, and here I think I would also like to mention that, we will be putting a link for Moelis Australia's website as well. And like Enda just mentioned, that Moelis Australia is ASX listed company as well. And they work very, very closely with the state and federal government bodies as well. And they have always participated in events, with Migration Institute of Australia-China Business Council, Financial Services Council, and Australian Chamber of Commerce in Asia. So if you need any information about Moelis Australia, definitely go to their website and have a look there. They have been managing, I think it's about 110 billion, isn't it, assets that you have been managing, Enda, with your company?
Actually, we've got 5 billion of assets under management here in Australia. So here in Australia, we have a very large funds management business. You mentioned our involvement in the SIV program. We've been involved from the very beginning. We're the pioneers of the program, having helped introduce the idea to the Australian government back in 2012. And since then, we've remained very close with the state and federal governments, who play a very important role in the SIV program. So I think you mentioned there, we regularly participate in events with the Migration Institute of Australia, which is the leading industry body for migration agents here, and also with the Financial Services Council, the FSC, which is the industry body for the financial services community, for fund managers, banks, and law firms as well involved in financial services. So the SIV is something we know very well. It's something we've been involved in from the beginning. We're probably the largest SIV fund manager in Australia right now. And I think you've mentioned probably earlier on that we see a very bright future for the SIV program. The Australian government has just committed shown its commitment to the program by doubling the allocation of business visas for next year, and by announcing that SIV would be given top priority in terms of processing for the financial year ahead. So all of those things are very strong indications of how strongly the Australian government supports it. And I think we'll continue to support the program well into the future.
Yeah. And also in the federal budget, they did mention, how they're going to improve the quality as well of these programs. So what do you expect? What are the possible changes maybe that might happen to the complying investment framework after July next year?
Sure. Yeah, so you're right. The government has flagged that it intends to apply some changes to the entire business visa program, which includes the SIV. And at this moment in time, we don't yet know what those final changes will be. The government hasn't made an official announcement, apart from the fact that there will be changes, and they will be implemented on the 1st of July 2021. Now, what we expect to happen for the SIV program is we don't expect an increase in the threshold above 5 million. It was previously discussed by the government that they may look to increase that amount. But I think there's been acceptance by the government that, particularly post-COVID, $5 million is already a very high bar. It's one of the highest in the world for these type of visas. So our estimate is it's probably unlikely that they'll change the threshold above 5 million. However, what is potentially going to happen is that they may increase the investment requirement into VCPE, or venture capital private equity. So we mentioned earlier on there was a 10% or $500,000 minimum investment in VCPE. There is possibility that the government will increase that amount from to as much as 10% or 20% of the threshold, which would be a $1 million investment requirement out of the 5. The government have previously flagged their thinking of doing this. They flagged it right back in 2015, because venture capital private equity is something that helps the Australian economy create jobs, it stimulates the economy, and it helps Australian businesses which are growing and emerging to expand and capitalize on overseas markets, for example. So it's something the Australian government likes a lot. So my prediction is that it's likely that we'll see an increase in the VCPE component, and probably a reduction in the balancing investment to 50%. So you may be looking at 20% in the VCPE, 30% into emerging companies, and 50% into balancing. But we just kind of have to wait and see what the final announcement looks like when the government brings out that in the next few months.
Yeah, and hopefully that will come into effect in the next financial year.
Correct, that's right.
Okay, and you also mentioned that it is possible to switch investments during the visa term, mainly balancing investments. So what happens if the value falls? Like, can the applicant still earn a return on their investment in that case?
Sure. Yeah, that's a very good question, Suman. So you're right. It's very important for investors to realize that if once their visa is granted, once the visa is granted by the Australian government, if the value of the investment falls, so if that $5 million investment value falls, the government does not require you to top up after the visa has been granted. They're not going to punish you for the fact that the investment has fallen in value. But likewise, if the value increases, so let's just say the 5 million increases to 6 million, you're not allowed to take that capital out until the end of the visa. So it's very important to note that capital must remain invested for the period of the visa. However, you are entitled to any income distributions that you earn on the way through. So for example, in the case of bonds, there would be dividends paid by those bonds, or commercial property funds will typically pay a distribution as well every quarter or 6 months or even annually. You're entitled to keep that income distribution that your funds earn during the period, but all capital must remain invested for the period of the visa.
Another thing we keep getting asked is that can investors, make decisions on their own investments, or can they invest on their own? Is that something which is allowed?
Okay, so that's a question we often get asked by investors. They often wonder if they can make investments in their own commercial property or use an investment they have in commercial property here or shares here. But unfortunately, you're not allowed to make your own direct investments for the complying investment framework. You must invest via a managed fund, and that managed fund has to be operated by a fund manager with a license from the Australian government. So direct investments, your own direct investments are not permitted. You must invest for all components in managed funds, which are managed by regulated fund managers.
Okay, that's really good information, and I think a lot of applicants who are planning to apply this visa, maybe looking at this visa, will have some basic information. But of course, each case is different. And then, if you want a one-on-one consultation, I'm available for the visa part of things. And or anybody from his team from Moelis Australia is available for a one-on-one consultation if anybody is interested at looking at this visa. So we can help you with the whole process. I will be putting a link to book a consultation with me in the description of this video. And similarly, we will be putting the contact details for enda as well. So you can directly get in touch with enda, or if you want to first of all see if you're eligible or not, you want to look at the visa side of things, you can get in touch with us regarding that as well. So we both will work together to help you with this whole application.
Sure, yeah, that's right, Suman. Look, we're happy to help. We've got people here in Sydney, Melbourne, also located in Hong Kong, in Shanghai and Beijing. So we've got various language capabilities across the team. I'm always happy to speak to investors face-to-face or in person if possible, but also via Zoom or else on video conference. So please feel free to reach out, drop us a line, let us know if you have any questions, and we're happy to talk you through the complying investment framework and the funds and the likely risks and returns of each of the funds in turn.
That's great. Thank you so much for the information you have given us.
To stay updated about Australia's immigration, make sure that you subscribe to our channel.